living well is difficult. If you think that's bad news, here's what you may think of as good news. Once you admit to yourself that living well is difficult, living well becomes less difficult. Why? You won't be burdened by attachment to unrealistic thoughts. So let's set aside the idea that living well is difficult and proceed to doing. It's important to be as kind to yourself as possible. Since there are plenty of real obstacles to living well already, making it a point to be as kind to yourself as possible is wise. Stay out of your own way by not creating additional difficulties for yourself. One way that many people fail to do that is by not clearly considering the nature of evidence. Evidence is the central notion in the philosophical subject of epistemology, or theory of knowledge. This video includes just a very brief introduction to thinking clearly about evidence. Its purpose is to ensure that you are not being unnecessarily hard on yourself. The point here is simply to make one distinction and then to apply it to one important domain. The distinction is between demonstrative evidence and non-demonstrative evidence. I already mentioned that distinction in the previous video. This is the difference between knowledge and opinion. To know that something is true is to have demonstrative evidence for it or about it. Anything short of that is, at best, non-demonstrative evidence, which is a characteristic of all opinions. Epistemology is really all about this distinction between knowledge and opinion. A quick way to put it is to state that although there can be false opinions, there's no such thing as false knowledge. What is demonstrative evidence? Following Panayot Butcheroff's argument in part 1 of his The Concept of Knowledge, we have demonstrative evidence when it's impossible for us to be mistaken in believing that something is the case. We know when mistake is impossible when we are unable to think about how we could be mistaken. We simply find that in a specific case. Admittedly, this does not guarantee the truth about P, where P stands for the proposition in question, but it's the best we humans are able to do, and there can't be any counterexamples to undermine this criterion. If so, when the truth of P is important, develop the habit of asking yourself, could I be mistaken in believing P? Is there any way that P could be false? The spiritual teacher Byron Katie does a lot of good work with this idea. This is usually not very difficult. In an attempt to stimulate some serious detachment, let's briefly consider both perception and memory as possible sources of knowledge. Suppose that you are sitting on the shore of a lake, looking at a boat on the water. Ask yourself, could I be mistaken in believing that there is a boat on the water before me now? Well, could you? Perhaps surprisingly, yes, you could be mistaken. That's why perception is not a source of knowledge. Not only did Descartes famously make an argument for that in his Meditations on First Philosophy, so-called First Philosophy is epistemology, the theory of evidence, and ontology, the theory of reality, but also the Pyrrhonian skeptics argued for it in ancient times. Also see my book, Personal Transformation. Have you ever had a nightmare that seemed so realistic that you were frightened? That's likely. However, all you really need to see that it's false that perception is a source of knowledge is just the possibility of such an experience. Why? That would be sufficient for you to conclude correctly that mistake is possible when considering perception as a source of knowledge. Suppose that you dreamed that you were seeing a boat on the lake. That might seem to be real, but something seeming to be real is not the same as it's being real. The point is sometimes put this way. Restrict the word perception to only cases of true, genuine, veridical perceptions. If so, there's no way to distinguish with certainty between cases of perceptions and cases of only apparent or seeming perceptions. There may be no phenomenological or experiential difference between the two. As a matter of fact, it's impossible for you to know now that you are awake. Remember that knowledge is finding mistake unthinkable. So ask yourself, how do I know I'm awake now? I believe that I'm awake, but do I really know it? No, you don't. If you disagree, just supply demonstrative evidence that you are awake now. What might it be? Suppose that your present visual experience is in color, and that you have only ever dreamed in black and white. You think, aha, that proves I'm awake because I see colors. Actually, no. Why couldn't this be your first dream in color? There's nothing to rule that possibility out. Suppose that you think that since everything is coherent and regular causal laws apply, you know that you are awake. After all, it's not as if you are riding on Pegasus or something. Here's the problem. Anything that you can experience in waking life can be experienced in dreams. So the fact that everything is coherent and regular causal laws apply does not entail that you are awake. There's no reason why the content of your dream cannot be such that it's not only coherent, but also governed by regular causal laws. In fact, whatever criterion you select for distinguishing the two can be dreamed to be applicable. You might find this quite shocking. So that's understandable. Welcome to serious, thoughtful, fundamental inquiry, otherwise known as philosophy. There's an important takeaway, namely that perception is not a source of knowledge. So just because you perceive something or seem to perceive it, it doesn't follow that it's real. What though about memory? What about correctly understanding the past? Nope. This now shouldn't be so shocking. After all, what you remember for the most part is only what you remember perceiving or seeming to perceive, right? If so, since the original perception itself wasn't a source of knowledge, how could merely remembering it be a source of knowledge? In other words, real memories and only apparent memories have the same relation as real perceptions and only apparent perceptions. Is there, for example, some experiential or phenomenological difference between a real memory and an apparent one with the same content? Not necessarily. Did you ever take a test, feel certain that you had correctly remembered the right answer and written it down, and later you discovered you were wrong? Is there some experiential or phenomenological difference between a real perception and an apparent one with the same content? Not necessarily. Did you ever take a hallucinogenic drug and see a rock wall melt? If you disagree, supply the criterion for infallibility. Just feeling certain is insufficient for ruling mistake out. So, when it comes to perceiving or remembering, there's always an element of doubt. Don't jump to the other conclusion, as some undergraduates are wont to do, that there are nothing but apparent or false perceptions or memories. It may be, as we usually think, that 99% of the time reality really is as we perceive it to be, or that the past was as we remember it to have been. Nevertheless, it's wise to detach from feeling certain about or attaching fanatically to any thoughts based on perception or memory. If you have understood the argument here correctly, learn the lesson and realize that we all should regularly have more epistemological humility. Perception is not a source of knowledge. Memory is not a source of knowledge. That's sufficient discussion of the distinction. Now, let's use it by applying it to an important subject matter. The application of that distinction is to the important ethical subject matter of right and wrong. The question is simple. Is there knowledge of right and wrong? This question is an important one. Why? It's because you may be making an assumption about your life that is unintentionally and perpetually creating unnecessary stress for you. That would not be being as kind to yourself as possible, would it? Excuse me. To answer that question, we need to answer the two logically prior questions, namely, what is knowledge and what is right and wrong? Only when we have those answers will we be in a position to answer the question, is there knowledge of right and wrong? We just answered the question, what is knowledge? Knowledge is having demonstrative evidence, which is finding mistake inconceivable. So, let's next ask, what is right and wrong? We should here be guided by what we ordinarily think and say. What are we talking about when we talk about right and wrong? Well, we're talking about actions or human acts, deliberate behaviors that we make or see people make. We think or say such things as what she did was wrong or what he did was right. What are we focusing on when we make such evaluations? Sometimes we focus on someone's intention in either doing something or not doing something. However, since it's really impossible to know about intentions, even our own, let's here set attention aside. Instead, distinguish between an act and its consequences. It's an ordinary distinction, An act of sexual intercourse, for example, is quite different from its consequences, which might be catching a sexually transmitted disease or the birth of a baby 9 months later. Once we have the ordinary act-consequence distinction, here's the critical question. Are the consequences of an act relevant to its moral evaluation as being either right or wrong? Well, would it not be absurd to ignore the consequences entirely? It seems to me that it would be. For example, suppose that some well-intentioned soldier deliberately pushed a button that launched a missile that began the next World War. It would be absurd ever to claim that what that soldier did was right. It might be reasonable to conclude upon examination that the act itself was well-intentioned and perhaps that the soldier should not be blamed or held accountable. However, the consequences of a world war are so disastrous that it would be a monumental error to ignore them and conclude that the act that initiated them was right. Of course it wasn't right, no matter how well-intentioned. If so, the consequences may not be the only factor that goes into deciding whether an act is right or wrong, but they should not be ignored. That leads to the next obvious question. Can there be knowledge of consequences? More specifically, can there be present knowledge of future consequences? It may seem so, but that's only if we restrict ourselves to very obvious and very short-term consequences. What about the consequences of some act that are still unfolding some hundreds of years from now? What about the consequences of some act that are still unfolding 1,000 or 1,000,000 years from now? Obviously, we have no idea whatsoever about what they will even be, let alone whether or not they will be beneficial once weighed against any detrimental consequences. This may seem far-fetched, but it's not. Let's suppose that you are a young man wondering whether or not to ask a girl for a date. You finally flip a coin, decide to ask, and perhaps to your surprise and delight, she decides to go. Well, let's also suppose that you two hit it off. In fact, you hit it off so well that you eventually get married, and you then have and raise children. Your children then grow up and get married and reproduce. One of your grandchildren turns out to be another Hitler or Stalin. Should you be blamed for asking that girl for a date? One of your other grandchildren turns out to be another Mozart or Beethoven. Should you be congratulated for your foresight? Of course not. You had no idea what would happen much later when you asked for that date. And here we're only talking about the next 2 generations. What about the next 200 generations or the next 2,000? Point made. There is no knowledge of right and wrong. Why? Again, right and wrong are judgments about actions. Since the consequences of actions are relevant to their moral evaluation, and since those consequences are unknowable, it's impossible to know right and wrong. If you're an adult, it's not likely that I'm telling you anything new here. You sometimes have struggled very much with decisions, haven't you? Been there, done that. If we could know what to do, life wouldn't be so difficult, so stressful. It'd be easy to make important decisions. We all make mistakes. Even sages make mistakes. Never think that they don't. There's a very important lesson here when it comes to unintentionally creating stress for yourself and others. When you assume that you should have known the right thing to do in some set of circumstances, you are making a false assumption. It's impossible to know right from wrong. You may, if you insist, blame yourself for having insufficient non-demonstrative evidence about what would be right in some set of circumstances, but it's senseless for blaming yourself for lacking demonstrative evidence. Holding yourself to an impossible standard is simply being foolish. Furthermore, what goes for you also goes for others. We're all human. We share the human condition. None of us knows right from wrong. At least occasionally we all struggle. That's life. Don't make life more difficult on yourself by attempting to hold yourself to some impossibly high standard. All you can do is all you can do. This goes for others too. Don't make life more difficult for them by attempting to hold them to some impossibly high standard. All they can do is all they can do. In short, however much you are attached to your favorite judgments about right and wrong, lighten up. Detach from them. You don't have God's eye view of reality. Neither do I. Neither does anyone else. Living well begins by accepting reality. If you would be wise, although you don't have to like it, Begin by accepting reality. There's no value to not accepting it.